obviously everyone knows what I'm here to talk about because it's one of the big pieces of news. So moving on swiftly to the agenda. So although it's a developer session, I'm going to break this down to effectively a coverage of some core areas across what we're getting from Commerce and CMS and .NET 5 upgrade in a presentation. And then I'm going to switch over and do a bit of a .NET 5 demo, just walking through the demo software that obviously is available with the Alloy Quicksilver demo, and just show some of that code that I'm going to be talking about just as a point, so it gives everyone a bit of a flavour as a whole of what you get out of this, what is the core sort of upgrade, what's the core sort of feature sets you've got, etc. And also in the point 4, although obviously it's not coming too early next year for existing clients, a little bit of talk around getting ready for the upgrade process and for future proofing and training over your sites to .NET 5. So I'm going to, for the .NET 5, what is .NET 5? Probably a lot of people know this. There's a little bit been covered by David as well already. So I'm just going to sort of flip through this very quickly because we hopefully all know this, but I just wanted to give a little bit of an intro. So obviously a lot of us have been working on the core .NET framework all the way back from 2002, all the way to its evolution in 4.8. As it's been mentioned, support for this is going away, and back all the way back in 2016, Microsoft created this .NET Core 1.0 version, which had aims of cross-platform support, performance improvements, structural changes to make it a lot more modern, a lot more aligned to a lot of other development mechanisms and things we were used to. So one of the problems though was, we had .NET Framework and .NET Core running in parallel for quite a while. Then .NET Standard came about to try and unify those APIs, and it all a bit messy. And now, so it's all unified into .NET 5, which is keeping the moniker and keeping the path of .NET Core, but basically giving us all those benefits that we've talked about. So one thing that's important there, when we talk about the long-term support and as well for the roadmap of what we know, we've obviously got the .NET 5 preview and the availability for new clients that has come out as announced today. But there's limited support for .NET 5 till February next year. So obviously as mentioned, there's going to be some changes. .NET 6 is on the horizon as well, hopefully at the beginning of next year, so that when that will hit the long-term support, and then obviously we'll be building everything on .NET 6. So that's quite an important one to be aware of. Obviously, the point of .NET 5 is to create this unified platform across, all of the things you want to build: desktop, web, cloud, mobile, gaming, all of that stuff. Also, create a nice unified tooling stack across all the any of the environments you want to be building on, be it Mac, Linux, Windows, etc., and have all these command line tools that we can use in a lot more of the modern way. So there's a few benefits. Performance has already been talked about a lot, so I'll skip that. Obviously, the long-term support, very important, and moving to obviously .NET 6, and then obviously all the future. So it's Microsoft invested in it, Optimizely invested in it, so it's great to know. So moving very quickly on. So we've got CMS 12 and Commerce 14. So what were the challenges that had to happen to make this work that I'd like to briefly mention? So obviously, for anyone who's been working with Optimizely for a long time, the admin area, we all know, legacy, web forms, it's been there for a long time. It's, a little clunky, but also on a technology which is now not supported. We've got the configuration, which is all obviously done via XML. And on that side, we've got the initialization, which obviously needs to be moved into a more modern way of how .NET Core and .NET 5 works. And then obviously a big one, there's lots of packages from third parties, but also from Optimizely that all need to be updated. And then obviously working out the best infrastructure for hosting the .NET 5, and then how to migrate existing projects. So first, I'm going to go into the demo and show it a bit more. But basically the core solution changes going through these to be aware of that I've seen from all of the examples, and the examples are going to show. First off, we're all, as developers who have been working with Alloy and working with Quicksilver, used to how to start these projects off. You either install the extension, you create your Alloy demo by creating it and going through a lot of dialogues, or you clone down Quicksilver. So a big point when it comes to .NET 5 is you've got the .NET CLI and we've got the ability to do everything on the command line, which is a lot more modern, a lot more like how things like Node.js and everything work nowadays. So it's very simple to get started with those projects that are currently available. All you have to do is effectively install the templates in the CLI from Optimizely, still labeled in some of the Episerver naming. But install those, get the CLI, create the project, and just do that for the command line. And you're up and going. You can do it very quickly. You can create that new project, have the Alloy demo or the Quicksilver demo ready to go with. It's a great one to pull down and start looking at and getting familiar with beyond what I'm going to show today when I do my demo. Really useful, and it's got some great information on it. So also we've moved away from having to use structure map. We've got dependency injection baked in now. So the dependency injection has all been moved into the basic ASP.NET dependency injection, which is great. So you don't have to worry about extra services or extra configuration. The www root now stores static website files, as I'll show in a minute. Not that important. There's not usually lots in there, but useful. The application now starts off from a program CS that initializes it and then basically then calls the startup CS file. So that then puts it, as you see on the right-hand side here, we've got a little piece of code which is taken from the startup file, which you can see a number of pieces of configuration here for either local development, but also for setting up all of the core services and basically all of the request pipeline, all of the services and everything that needs to happen. You can see some examples here and things we're probably all used to doing. For example, if you've ever created an initialization module to configure TinyMCE, instead of doing that in an initialization module, now you can pull it out and put it in here and create a TinyMCE setup for this code, which is all very cool. And I think it's really good having it in this, a nice flow where you can see this in the startup file, which is really good. Big one that we've got is there's obviously, as you said, no configuration XML files. So things are now been moved to either JSON or handling the startup. So you've got things like the app settings.json, which has some configuration areas for maybe logging or local connection strings or extra configuration if you need it. But a lot of the configuration is now being done basically in code at this startup point. So the startup file, as you see, is development, but you can also query this to see which environment it's on. So if you need to swap out and change how some of the services work, say you've got, say you're using Azure Identity and you want to only have that when you're on the DXP, you can do that, set that up. Local development could still use ASP.NET or something like that. So you can really customize that in the code and you can really see that. It's really cool. So the other one we've got there is the bundling. Although a lot of stuff has been moved into code, whereas bundling used to be code, now in the examples, the bundling configuration is all handled in a bundle config that I will show in a second. And as mentioned, I've put links at the bottom left of all my slides to core pieces of information, and they are summarized at the end. So when you get these slides, but basically that's where you can go to get the NetCore preview. And this has the demos for CMS 12 and Commerce 14. And so play with them, use them, and there's feedback on GitHub. But obviously there's the ability to now use it in a real scenario now. So a couple of little bits about what you get from effectively the editing and the user interface, and what we can see as developers that is great, and also what we can sell to clients, what we can talk about, which is really cool, is the user interface and editing. The dashboard and the reports area is gone. Dashboard is an area where a lot of people don't tend to use a lot, but there are some core gadgets and stuff that a lot of people might have used, such as the 404 handler, which is a gadget item you put in there, and a lot of people use it for 404s. So at the moment, as we mentioned, when it comes to packages, they are still going to have to wait until a lot of packages, if and when they are ported over. So things like the 404 manager will need to be ported over. I've already seen such as a logging plugin that was recently talked about on the blogs that has already been ported over as an admin extension, in the same way that you would create the extra areas inside the editor interface, which is really cool. The admin area, and this is something we wait for ages because we talked about the fact that they were all web forms, has all been rewritten. It's really cool. You've got the access rights to schedule job management, configuration, and all of your tooling, managing of the websites and the languages. Some of these have been enhanced. I like the fact that Scheduled Jobs has had some of the features of one of these Scheduled Jobs packages, which was a Scheduled Job Manager, which now tells you the frequency and gives you a little bit of graph of how long it's run, etc. Gives a bit of performance on it, which is quite useful. But that's in there now. To be aware, though, there are a couple of areas that haven't been ported over yet. I've had a talk with Martin around some of these areas. So we've got managed content and convert pages. So managed content is something that's been useful when it comes to building extensions. Sometimes you have these, like shadow nodes that you create under the global node, and you need to check permissions. You need to delete them if you need to recreate non-initialization modules. So currently, the managed content where you could see that isn't there. I'm told it's probably going to be ported over, and convert pages hasn't been ported over. So convert pages was obviously useful in some scenarios if you needed to make a new type and you needed to convert some existing content. But on the whole, it's a really good, update for this, and it will make the experience for the, editors, the admin editors, a lot better. And because obviously dashboards, reports have gone, GUI plugin, page plugin, those sort of ones have been deprecated and removed. And obviously there's some support for, as mentioned, this, David's already mentioned some of this, but the JS frameworks and the front end sort of libraries now that can make this a lot better for creating the editing experience and consuming experience of these frameworks, etc. So commerce, a couple of things to be aware of. There's now, as some people have already mentioned, Commerce Manager, which was one of the biggest pain points for a long time, has now been removed. So although some areas have been migrated, so you've got markets, warehouses, catalogs, tax configurations, etc. It's basic and shipping and payments. You have to be aware of that. Basically, some areas such as importing, exporting catalogs, adding countries and regions, some currency management, business object configuration and meta classes, they've actually been dropped, and there isn't an admin interface at the moment. So these need to be configured by the API. So one area that is interesting to look at inside the commerce demo, the Quicksilver demo that you can get obviously from GitHub, is that there's some migration code there which migrates and configures and creates a lot of this stuff in there, which is quite interesting. But you obviously have to create codes to be able to configure any customization. So if you're used to adding extra stuff into business objects for storing stuff, you obviously have to move that into code now. And officially, membership as one of the dependencies is dropped. So when you're working with the .NET 5 as a whole, you have to migrate everything to ASP.NET Identity. Obviously, that should be a big job. Khan has a long time ago done a blog post on migrating. So if you haven't done it, it's fairly easy, and you can keep all of your passwords as well, which is very useful. And so a little bit about the digital experience platform. So one thing that it was mentioned that there's going to be provisioning for DXP. So one thing to be aware of is the new .NET 5 stuff is primarily going to be moving to Linux web apps over there. That has an inherent knock-on that some of the maintenance page configuration isn't going to be there to start off with because of the way maintenance page is configured with the standard IIS approach. I'm told it will come, but it's not going to be there supported at first from what I'm told. This will require, as mentioned, new Azure provisioning. So if you are migrating a client or moving them over, so just be aware that you're going to be creating new Azure provisioning. So your Azure, your DevOps pipelines and your configuration, the deployment API, all of your configuration and access, you'll get new environments for that. You'll have to switch that over, and you'll have to be aware of that. Obviously, we've mentioned configs have gone, so config transforms are one thing that we won't have anymore. The files that we talked about that were JSON, such as the app settings, they will just have basically an integration pre-prod or production suffix at the end, and it will load whichever is the actual one for that environment. So there's no more worrying about basically transformation processes as you push these up the tree, up the pipeline from integration pre-prod to production. And one other thing is the deployment API is required. So although I've been told the integration can be pushed to pre-prod and prod when it comes to the PaaS portal, you have to deploy the code as a package up into integration. So as a point of obviously getting ready, be aware that you need to do that, and you'll have to switch over to basically deployment API mechanism. Again, it's linked to the bottom. It's not actually that difficult, but there are some nuances around that. But the removal of config transforms will make it a little bit easier, which is cool. So before I go into my demo, and show a little bit of the actual code. So what's on the roadmap? We've got the .NET 5 release at the moment. We've got the .NET 6 update coming end of year, early next year for the long-term support, which goes all the way through to 2024, I think. And then obviously at the moment, some of the documentation for the .NET 5 release has some broken links, and it's a bit spotty in some areas. I assume that's on the way that's going to be improved and made a lot better. Obviously, we're expecting, Optimizely are working hard on the supporting packages that are going to be supported for this one, but they're also the third-party packages. Most partners and developers will have to update themselves. So hopefully there'll be some drive to do that. I know people like Valdis and Getter already are hot on updating some of their packages. The re-adding of the admin features that I mentioned aren't there at the moment, which is still fairly useful. And obviously, the rebranding as of a very recent version has now come about, and the rebranding now exists in there. And you'll see it when I quickly show my demo. So, moving swiftly on to what people actually want to see most of. So, hopefully everyone can see this. Yep, cool. So I'm just going to run through a couple of the parts that I mentioned here and just go through them a little bit and explain them. So as we talked about, now the start of the application initialization comes in the program. So program starts all of the conventions. That is some of the stuff we'd be familiar from, obviously standard, ASP.NET Core and 5. But basically the core thing here is this web builder use startup, which jumps straight into our basically startup class. So in the startup class and this configure services, that's the one we saw on my presentation example. So this is the area where you can really do all of your key customization. So for example, we've got all of the is development here. We can turn the scheduler off so that we know that locally it's not on, but on an environment like the DXP, it's always enabled. The configuration here for the connection strings. There's core areas of services for, obviously, from the core libraries for enabling all of the ASP.NET configuration. Obviously, as you said, web config is gone. Configuration needs to come in here. Basically, as you go through this, you'll see all of the standard MVC configuration and setup. You'll see the areas that set up Alloy. We're all familiar with things like display options, etc. They are traditionally configured in, again, initialization modules, but these are all now configured in here. So you can see like adding Alloy, adding your display resolutions. If you want to customize your tiny MCE configuration, you've got this in here as that extension. So basically where you might have thought before, initialization modules, very cool, put them in, I'm gonna target that. Now you have to move to this. Initializable module is still in the framework and it's still there, and I think it's more for compatibility at the moment. But some of the dependencies that you could put in, such as there was a dependency to the TinyMC initialization that you would put above your class declaration, that is now gone. So I know that people have tried to continue to use initialization modules in .NET 5 and it's not worked. So most of these should be ported over to here, and I believe it's best to put everything in here and move it into a nice place you can see all of this stuff. And then obviously your standard configuration, setting up your exception pages, etc., those sorts of areas. Things, again, we don't have in the web config side. Setting up your routing, etc., that sort of stuff. So moving on from the startup file, some of the areas I mentioned, we've got the app settings config here. So this is some of the local logging configuration. If you have local connection strings, you can put them in there and load them in there as well. That's that sort of process. You could put your own configuration in this, and then you could load that out. The bundle config now has some of the information here, which is a lot more like what you'd expect to see in bits like Node and other frameworks where this is all configured here. This is a benefit for obviously front-end developers who are used to working with it. In the past, I've had to train people in how to set up your bundling configuration in C# code. So it's very useful to have this here as well in an easier way for some of the more modern development. One area I didn't mention, but where we're used to using effectively your block controllers before, and setup has a little bit of a change in the configuration. So we've now got this block component. This has changed a little bit over the last couple of versions. This was in Invoke, and it's now Invoke component. But basically, it's very similar to how it worked before, but has been slightly changed. But again, look at the code, but you become familiar with it yourself. And so moving on to, this is now the startup for, if you haven't looked at the demo, the Netcore preview demo is separated into the MVC and the commerce. So looking at the startup for commerce, we then have a lot more configuration as you'd expect. We've got things such as basically market configuration in here for some of the market services. We have basically a lot more information for some of the stuff that you would normally be configuring for commerce, and also some Kestrel configuration. Basically, a lot more of the commerce configuration and information you'd want in here. And I briefly mentioned it, but you've also got this migration step here that is here, which has a lot of information and code that you can look at for basically setting up some of the warehouses, configuring your payment methods in code, configuring shipping methods, and basically migrating and moving over a load of information, which is useful for obviously anything you want to do programmatically or migrating content over. And that comes from some exported data that's inside the app data. So I think that's probably enough for that. And very briefly, just to see what this looks like, we've now got the nice branded Optimizely logo and login. This now logs in, and where you see here, this is the admin area as we talked about, very nice and shiny. Scheduled jobs, as mentioned, has this now graph which shows you the history and the overview of how it's running. Everything's a lot cleaner, slicker, as it was mentioned by David. This runs a lot better as well, being on .NET 5 as well. But obviously, it's also been updated to be front end first and very clean. So it's all very nice and slick. So moving back into my demo. The next is just a little bit about preparing and future-proofing. So it was mentioned, but basically, if you go into the world documentation, you'll see talk about an upgrade assistant. I know people like I know one of the MVPs, Darren, has already started using this, and I think a few people have touched on it. But basically, the Upgrade Assistant is a Microsoft CLI tool which you can run, and it can give you basically go through all of the steps as you see here of creating backups, trying to convert, trying to give you advice, updating NuGet packages, and then basically trying to auto convert and give you advice of the upgrade. It uses MS Build, and it's a command line tool. There is also an Optimizely upgrader, but at the moment the documentation in World that links to it goes to a secure page you've got to sign into, which I haven't got access to, so hoping to get more information on that. But basically, your projects need to compile, and there's also a number of command line switches when you run this. So I haven't used this too much myself, but it's just an important thing to know about for when you want to talk about existing projects. So next is just going to be, I've talked about some of these, but I just want to run through, the mentality of upgrading and migrating a project over that you've got existing, because we're all going to have lots of clients on it, and they're all going to be really capable of doing, and they're really going to be wanting this to migration, these benefits, the performance, etc. So what do you have to think about? Connection strings, logging, move these over to the app settings if you need to, or obviously the settings within having the DXP if it's not local. This will just pull this stuff over. Move all of your config initialization to startup, get rid of things that are initialization modules where you can, move everything over, move everything that's configured in any web config that you need to do, set up any modules, any custom packages you've got into that startup file. Rewrite any web-based components you've got. So if you've got anything that, albeit, we all don't like web forms nowadays, or most people like, MVC, and web forms are very old school. If you've got anything in there, you have to rewrite it. So at one point, if you're looking, I've looked inside all the packages, and one pain point was the optimize the forms was always done with ASCX controls, and now this has been migrated to be CSHTML files. So one thing is a lot of people tend to customize this, put extra accessibility things in it, and often people have overridden this and extracted it and changed it. So now this is now refreshed, so you want to pull this back over, add any customizations that you need, unless you changed it to CSHTML when you moved it over. But you obviously still want to look for a refresh because it's likely changed quite a bit. Obviously, the DI framework, as you mentioned, all been replaced to the ASP.NET default. So, obviously, look at the examples, migrate where you need to. If there's any problems, you might have to change, look into some of the more complex stuff if you've done any complex areas, but the DI framework's pretty good. And there's a big change to the routing system where it moved over now. So you just basically have a look at that and make sure that your routing all works and configure that, change it over, get rid of any ASP.NET membership if you have it, and move that all over to obviously ASP.NET Identity. There's no support now for the old school CMS search, so everything should now be moved to a different search implementation, such as search and navigation. So you want to obviously move all of that over. Commerce, obviously handle any of those updates that we talked about to the removed areas. They all need to be through the API configuration. On the right here, you can see all of those areas. So you can have a look at some of the example code in the commerce implementation, and then obviously build your own code to set that up and configure it, add in your own meta fields and configurations where you need to. Move all of that config file information to the startup. Handle removement of some of the payment. There's basically some of the payment classes don't implement authorized net, so they have been removed. So there's some removal of payment classes that need to be handled on this. Solar support's been removed, so obviously again everything to search and navigation, and some of the core ASP.NET types don't support binary serialization. So if you've got any of those where you are serializing them onto, carts or areas, you might just have to look at that and change some of that around. And then there's not a lot of changes when it comes to search and navigation, but now obviously everything needs to be initialized and done in the startup. So configure it. There's a whole load of classes and settings for setting up how this conventions and how everything will work. At the moment, there's not support for looking inside Word PDFs and previewing the information into that. But obviously, hopefully, that will come. And then packages, obviously, as you mentioned, third-party packages, you have to be aware that a lot of them might not be updated yet. So if you're looking to migrate a project over or to use packages in a new build that you aren't sure supported, you'll have to wait for those. You might have to look at other ways of doing things if you want to migrate stuff over, and wait till those developers have pushed those changes and those updates. So yes, BVM 404 handler, as I said, we just had the shout out there. A lot of people using it, very popular package there. So, hopefully that will get updated and support soon, but there's obviously a large amount of useful packages. I think we've all used so many of the Getter packages in our tool stack as well. So, hopefully those guys are heavy at it. Packages that use the dashboard, as you mentioned, the 404 handler, and then obviously the form package has those changes to CSHTML. So, just be aware of all of that information. And finally, the coverage of that DSP and infrastructure. So integration needs to be deployed to via the deployment API. So for your existing clients where you've got your pipelines, if you aren't doing that and you're doing web publishes or even whole bit FTP deployments, you'll have to migrate that over. So, you can do that now. You can get going straight away. There's no point in, holding off on migrating your pipelines over and, setting all this stuff up. Handle those config transforms, push everything to the startup, check for your environment variables, all of that, so you can deploy stuff and check for integration, pre-prod reduction where you need to, whereas before we would have done config transforms. Be aware that there's new provisioning required. So, talk to customers, work it out, and then do that migration. And then obviously handle the lack of maintenance support. You could use Smooth Deploy, for example. Obviously, there's that issue with the write mode where, you're going to lose some of the changes in the interim. So depending on your scenarios, you could use Smooth Deploy or we can wait for the maintenance support. And the other big one there is just as a throw out in the end there is IS specific web config settings. loads of us have always used things like IS Rewrite, redirects to be able to redirect to your sort of HTTP to HTTPS. Obviously that doesn't exist anymore. There's no web config in there. We're moving to Linux apps, so you have to use things like the core pipe, some of the stuff that's built into ASP.NET Core, and configure those in code, etc. for that. And then any of the other stuff that you're used to using, sort of reverse proxying and stuff like that, those sorts of things, you have to look at and migrate. Anything that you have is, IS. But I'm sure there'll be lots of blogs and information coming out. And finally, all of the stuff that I've seen, all the blogs that I think are useful, all the breakdowns, Mark's breakdown, my breakdown, a load of other ones that are in the blogs, testing with CMS12, I've linked all here. So when you get those slides, you can just go through these and pull out all that information very quickly. Cool, and that's it. Hopefully I didn't go too far over. I know this is a bit of a broad overview, but hopefully it helps everyone to get a bigger picture of the entire